My name is Aldric, not a name you hear often anymore. Maybe that's fitting, because my life never followed any template. I never wanted the white picket fence routine. I didn't dream of PTA meetings or couples brunches. I wanted connection, the raw kind. Truth without polish. Loyalty without a scoreboard. And for a while, I thought I had it. I met Sela in the strangest way, a stranded evening at an airport bar in Baton Rouge. We were 2 delayed flights and 1 shared bottle of wine away from being strangers. She was bold, unpredictable, said things like, "You ever wonder what your life would look like if you just vanished 5 years ago?" I married her 9 months later. Fast forward 8 years, and I didn't recognize the woman walking around our house. Her eyes still had that fire, but it wasn't for me. Her laugh rang louder when her phone buzzed. She'd started dressing different. Not better, not worse. Just as if she was going somewhere I wasn't invited. And then came the night of the party. I wasn't supposed to know. She told me it was a work thing, some team-building mixer in the city. I nodded, smiled, pretended I didn't already know the address she mentioned belonged to her ex, Grant Weller. Grant. That name hadn't come up in years. But something about it made my jaw tense. So I didn't say a word. I just watched her put on that crimson dress I hadn't seen in months. Watched her spray perfume behind her ears, not once looking in my direction. Watched her check her reflection in the hall mirror and whisper, almost too softly for me to hear, "You won't even care." That was the part that cut. Not the lie. Not the party. Not even the ex. It was the idea that I'd stopped mattering. So I made a decision. While she was gone, giggling in old memories, maybe brushing shoulders with temptation, I didn't call, didn't text. I wrote her a note and left it by the coffee maker. I packed only what I needed. 1 duffel, my documents, and a sealed envelope addressed to our joint bank. I wasn't running. I was done being invisible. But when Sela came home the next morning, hungover from nostalgia and the sour scent of someone else's cologne clinging to her, she found silence. A half-empty closet. And that note waiting under the soft click of the percolator. She didn't expect me to walk. She didn't expect what I'd taken with me. She didn't expect the storm she'd started to circle back and hit her harder than she ever saw coming. And that was only the beginning. There's something strange about driving away from your own home before sunrise, knowing you won't return. Not for a jacket you forgot. Not to say goodbye. Not even to slam the door. I didn't leave in rage. I left in silence. The kind of silence that stays with you long after the engine dies. The streets were still sleeping. My old truck coughed and groaned like it knew this drive meant more than just another morning errand. I didn't have a destination. Not exactly. But I knew where I wouldn't be, and that was enough. A few miles out, I pulled into a gas station and just sat there. A couple of truckers exchanged nods. A kid cleaned bugs off his windshield with the kind of intensity only heartbreak or caffeine could explain. I didn't move. My phone was still off. Not because I feared her calls, but because I didn't want them. The note I left for Sela was short. Not bitter. Not poetic. Just truth, with no decoration. You don't have to pretend anymore. I saw the RSVP. I know where you were. And I've seen enough. This house, this life, you're welcome to it. But my peace? That leaves with me. She wouldn't cry when she read it. She wasn't built that way. She was the kind of woman who hated consequences. And that note? That was the first consequence she hadn't seen coming. But let me rewind a bit. 2 nights before the party, I found the message. A name buried in her phone notifications. Not Grant, of course. That would be too obvious. No. It was saved as Mallory, HR. And I almost believed it. Until I saw the last message. He still thinks it's a work mixer. You're free to stay the night. No judgment. Like old times. No judgment. I laughed, once. Not because it was funny, but because I remembered when I used to be the one she whispered, like old times, too. I spent that night on the back porch, no lights, just the hum of distant traffic and the occasional bark of a restless dog. I thought of every moment we'd shared, the gas station sushi runs, the time she cut her foot dancing barefoot on the kitchen floor, the way she once curled into my chest during a storm and whispered, "Promise me you'll never walk away." I kept that promise longer than she deserved. But now it was time for her to understand what silence sounds like when it's real. By mid-morning, I had a temporary rental in a quiet town 2 hours north. No one knew me there. The neighbors minded their own business. There was a diner down the road where people still asked if you wanted the usual, even if they'd just met you yesterday. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't revenge. It was mine. I checked my phone after lunch. 5 missed calls. 2 voicemails. No texts. Sela never liked putting things in writing. Too permanent. Too risky. Too traceable. I didn't listen to the voicemails. Just save them in case I ever needed to remind myself why I left. Later that night, I received the first photo. Not from her. From an old mutual friend. Brent. We hadn't spoken in almost a year. His message was brief. Did you know she brought Grant upstairs? Thought you'd want to know what kind of party it really was. Attached was a blurry but unmistakable shot. Sela leaning into Grant's chest. Both of them lit by the sickly orange glow of some cheap hallway lighting. Her heels were off. Her hand was on his stomach. His mouth was too close to her ear. I stared at it for a full minute before deleting it. Not because it didn't hurt, but because it didn't change anything. I'd already left. And that was the part she hadn't planned for. She thought I'd argue. Thought I'd blow up her phone. Thought I'd grovel or compete or threaten. But I didn't. I left so quietly that it echoed. And when she finally found me, when she stepped into that diner and looked me in the eye, she didn't scream, didn't apologize, didn't even blink. She just said, "So you're really done?" And I smiled. Because what I was about to tell her would break every illusion she'd ever built. She didn't knock. She didn't pause. She simply walked in like it was still her home, like the smell of another man's cologne wasn't still clinging to her wrists. Her keys jingled softly in her hand. Her heels clicked against the tile with measured rhythm, like she was counting each step. But the sound stopped abruptly when she turned the corner into the kitchen. Silence. No morning coffee. No toast crumbs. No hum from the refrigerator door being left open like she always did. The place was still, untouched, as though I'd been erased from the photo we once lived inside. Then she saw the first sign. Her favorite ceramic mug, the navy blue one with the chipped handle, sat alone in the sink. But it wasn't used. It was placed intentionally. Dry, clean, upside down. Next, her eyes went to the counter. My wallet. Gone. The picture of her and me on our anniversary, which used to sit in that little wood frame beside the fruit bowl. Missing. The drawer she knew I always kept locked. Empty. Slightly ajar. Silent confession. Then came the hallway. She walked slowly now. I imagined what she was thinking, though her face was unreadable. Confusion first, maybe frustration second. But nothing prepared her for the bedroom. The closet door was wide open. My half, vacant. Hangers swung like the aftermath of a windstorm, space where my suits once lived stretching like a wound across the wood. She reached out and ran her hand across the hangers, like they might offer an answer. Her fingers lingered on one of my old belts that had slipped off and stayed behind, curled like a dead snake on the floor. Then she noticed the letter. I left it folded in half on the pillow. No envelope. No name. Just the words. Everything loud in you made everything quiet in me. She stood there holding it like it was made of glass. I know her. Sela hates silence. She needs motion, needs people around her to remind her she's still someone worth orbiting. But this wasn't noise. This was absence. And absence is heavier than anger. She didn't cry. Sela doesn't believe in tears, not real ones. She thinks emotions are for leverage, for turning the tide in arguments. But this moment, she had no tide to turn. The shore had vanished. I watched the entire thing. No, not from inside the house. I was parked 2 houses down, engine off, windows cracked just enough to breathe. I needed to see her see it. Not out of spite, not to gloat, but because I wanted to make sure it landed. That the message I'd written not with ink, but with absence, was read. She stumbled a little when she sat down on the edge of the bed. Like her knees weren't fully convinced of their job. Her hand went to her temple, as if she could rub the fog of what she'd done into something softer, more forgivable. But this wasn't about forgiveness anymore. She'd gone to her ex's house, stayed the night, then walked into our home like it was a commercial break. As if I'd still be there, sipping coffee, ready to pretend it hadn't happened. As if love was made of elastic, not glass. She didn't expect me to be quiet. That's the part that shook her. Sela had always relied on the fact that I'd argue, that I'd fight, that I'd try to reclaim her like property gone missing. But instead, I let her taste solitude. I let her hear how loud it is when no one's chasing you. After a while, she stood up and walked around the room. Not searching, just pacing, as if trying to collect the scattered moments that once made this space feel like ours. But there were no moments left. Just furniture and wallpaper and the shell of something we both ruined. She finally reached for her phone. I could see her thumb trembling as she unlocked it. She paused before pressing call. My name lit up. I watched the screen flash. Watched her stare at it like it might blink first. I didn't answer. She called again. And again. Each time, her breath grew faster, her hands more erratic. I knew that look. Not grief, not regret. Panic. The moment when the game stops being fun and you realize no one's left to play with. I stayed in the car for 10 more minutes. Then I drove away without turning my head. She had her answers. But I had the silence. And I wasn't giving it back. No one ever teaches you what to do after you've already walked away. There are books on healing, quotes about strength. But nothing prepares you for the moments that follow the moment, when you've made your exit, and the door closes behind you with a softness that feels permanent. The motel room I checked into wasn't poetic. The bedspread was stiff, patterned in outdated flowers, like it had witnessed too many half-lives. The air smelled faintly of bleach and resignation. There was a mirror across from the bed that caught the tiredness in my face before I could look away. Still I stayed. Not because it was comforting, but because it was far enough. Far enough from her perfume, from our routines, from the way my name sounded in her mouth when she needed something. I spent the first evening doing nothing, deliberately. No TV, no music, just listening to the silence, hour by hour, minute by minute, until it stopped feeling like punishment and started feeling like control. I didn't check her messages. I knew they were there, buzzing like ghosts just beneath the glass of my screen. She wasn't the type to leave voicemails. Words, for her, had always been better when they could be deleted, rewritten, reframed, but I knew she was calling. I could sense it the way an old sailor feels a shift in the air before the storm. And I let it all ring. Because silence, real silence, isn't the absence of noise. It's the presence of everything they thought you'd say, but don't. The next morning, I did something unexpected. I made a list, not of things I missed, of things I tolerated, things I'd ignored over time to preserve peace that never existed. Her second phone, she said, was for work. The locked drawer she never let me open. The constant eye rolls when I tried to share joy. The conversations she never finished, especially the ones where I asked, "Is there someone else?" I wasn't angry, just stunned at how far I'd bent to keep something upright that had long since collapsed. After the list, I went walking. There was a park nearby, cracked benches, gravel paths, ducks in a stagnant pond. An old man nodded to me from a chess table he seemed to live at. I nodded back. Neither of us spoke. There was something honest about the place. People weren't trying to be anything but there. I sat under a tree and watched shadows change direction with the afternoon light. Hours passed without demand. I felt invisible in the best way. Like no one here expected me to explain why I looked like I'd just shed a life. Then my phone buzzed again. Different number. New voice. Male. I didn't recognize it at first. But the words were sharp. Cold. Deliberate. "You think leaving makes you righteous? You should know. She's not crying. She's laughing. At how you folded so easily." I didn't flinch. I just saved the voicemail, titled it Confirmation. That was Grant. Her ex. The one whose party she stayed at. The one who thought he'd won something. But he didn't know that I didn't leave to lose. I left to begin the second half of my story. And she wasn't in it. That night, I turned the mirror toward the wall and fell asleep on top of the sheets. No dreams. No interruptions. Just breath. And somewhere, I imagined her pacing that house, touching empty frames, calling disconnected numbers, rewriting her narrative in a dozen new drafts that would all be missing the one line that mattered. He didn't come back. And I wouldn't. Because when I left, I didn't vanish. I became unreachable. She used to say I was predictable. It was one of those things she threw out during quiet fights, the kind of fight where no one raises their voice, but everything feels like it's breaking. "You never surprise me, Aldric. You never shake anything." She wanted chaos, but the kind that made her feel alive, not responsible. I gave her order, so she slipped into disorder when I wasn't looking. Now, without me in the house, she'd finally gotten what she claimed to want, the freedom to self-destruct without witnesses. But what she didn't realize, she was still being watched. On the third night of my disappearance, I wasn't in the motel anymore. I was standing in the living room of a woman I hadn't seen in nearly a decade. Her name was Ivy. Before you assume anything, no, we hadn't slept together. There were no romantic candles, no flirty glances. We just sat on opposite sides of her couch, holding tea in chipped mugs, two people who remembered who the other used to be. Ivy was my sister's old roommate, one of the rare people who saw through Sela the first time she met her. I hadn't believed her then, I remember that night, she said, watching me over the rim of her cup. Sela walked in and scanned the room like she was trying to decide which face would make her feel most important. I didn't argue. I didn't defend. Because in hindsight, Ivy was right. Sela always needed an audience. But now the audience had left the theater. The lights were up, and the actress was still pretending it was her scene. Ivy had something for me. She walked into the next room and came back holding a thin cardboard box, taped closed but weathered. "You're going to want to sit for this," she said. Inside, photographs. Not new, but not old enough to be from another life. Printed screenshots of texts between Sela and Grant, spanning a year. Locations, messages, plans. Every time I thought she was at a networking event, she'd been pre-scheduling a performance behind my back. They even joked about it. "He thinks I'm mentoring new hires." Faced with tears of joy, I should get an award. "Just flash that ring a bit. Keeps you safe." I won't tell. He's not dumb, but he's slow to move. Good for us. My hands didn't shake. I wasn't surprised. I was just done. Ivy hesitated before handing me the last item. It was a flash drive. "Security footage," she said quietly. "From Grant's building. He must have gotten careless. Or arrogant." I didn't watch it. I didn't need to. What mattered wasn't what they did in that apartment. What mattered was how I let it end. I returned to the motel just before midnight. Room still untouched. My bag in the corner. My toothbrush still dry. I opened my laptop, uploaded the screenshots, and sent a copy to a secure legal folder. Then I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the carpet for a while, not thinking, just breathing. And in that moment, it hit me. Sela thought I'd be sitting in the dark, grieving the loss of her. What she didn't expect was that someone else had already opened the window and let the air in. Not romantically, not sexually, but with truth, clarity. Ivy reminded me who I used to be before I shrunk myself to make room for a woman who needed more space than she ever earned. And now, I didn't want her back. I wanted her exposed, not to the world, but to herself. To that quiet moment when she'd stare into her reflection and realize. She lost a man who never raised his voice, who never needed to hurt her to leave, who simply walked away and never once looked back, not out of bitterness, but because peace had finally shown him the exit. The front door still closed the same way. Soft catch, faint click, a hush that wrapped itself around the hallway. But the man who used to stand behind it wasn't home anymore. Sela didn't know it yet, but every corner of the house was betraying her. The lights she always left on now turned themselves off after 5 idle minutes. The hallway speaker that used to play our Sunday jazz? Quiet, disconnected. Even the plants in the kitchen, once trimmed by my hands, had started browning at the edges. This wasn't a house falling apart. This was a house reflecting what it had become, a stage without an audience. I didn't go back, but I had eyes everywhere. Not out of pettiness, but precision. Every camera I'd installed years ago to keep us safe, she'd forgotten about them. Or ignored them, assuming I wasn't watching anymore. She assumed wrong. I watched her move through that house like she didn't know how to fill it. She opened the fridge 6 times in 2 hours, never taking anything out. She picked up my old sweatshirt, held it to her face, then dropped it like it burned. She called 3 people, laughed with none, and then she made the mistake of calling him. Not on speaker this time, not out loud, but I read her lips on the footage, clear as day. He left. I didn't think he'd actually go. She didn't sound guilty. She sounded annoyed. Like a magician who'd rehearsed her grand finale only to find the audience had walked out during intermission. Grant didn't answer. Good. Because he and I had spoken, once. No threats. No shouting. I just told him what he didn't want to hear. That he wasn't the first. Or the only. Just the most recent mistake Sela hadn't buried well enough. He said nothing in return. That silence was all the confirmation I needed. In my new space, not a motel, not a friend's couch, but a cabin outside a mountain town where the air didn't care who I used to be. I started to breathe differently. The mornings came without alarm clocks. The walls didn't echo her name. The world moved slower, and somehow more honestly. I learned to cook for one again. I learned to walk without checking for her shadow. I learned that absence, when chosen, doesn't hurt. It heals. And one night, around 11:23 p.m., I received a message. Not a call. A video. No subject line. Just her name and a file. I almost deleted it. But instinct told me, don't. I opened it. It wasn't her face on the screen. It was the living room. Our living room. but from an angle she didn't know was still being recorded. She was drunk, alone, talking to the empty air like it owed her answers. He was supposed to chase me, she said. He always does. He's the type. Loyal. Predictable. Safe. I could have had both. Grant for the spark. Aldric for the structure. But now they're both gone, and I don't even know who I am in this house anymore. She laughed at the end, but it cracked halfway through. The laugh turned into a breath. The breath turned into silence. The silence turned into her falling asleep on the rug. No blanket. No lights. No one. I didn't reply. Didn't forward it. Didn't share it with friends to mock. Instead, I took a screenshot, not of her, but of the empty room behind her. A perfect still image of a woman surrounded by the choices she'd made. And I saved it in a folder titled, Proof of Peace. Because that's what she gave me, by trying to break me. Not a reason to fight, but a reason to never return. You know what's strange? Doors don't slam anymore. Not the ones in newer houses. They're built with soft close hinges. So even when someone wants to leave dramatically, all they get is a quiet click. And that's what I gave her. A quiet click. Not a slammed door. Not a final word. Just the hush of everything she thought would last, folding in on itself. She didn't know I'd bought the land 5 months earlier. It started as a joke, some ad I saw during lunch. Untouched 2-acre parcel. Remote. Silent. Yours. I stared at that word. Silent. I called the number. Spoke to a man named Rowan. Older voice. Worn, but clear. By that evening, I owned it. Not out of impulse. Out of instinct. Somewhere in me, I think I already knew Seela had begun building an exit for herself. So I quietly built mine first. By the time she spent the night at Grant's, I had more than land. I had a cabin. Solar. Clean water. And a view of the sky so wide, you couldn't lie under it without feeling like a grain of salt in the ocean. I called it the map. Because when I was there, I remembered how to find myself. By the 4th day of her silence, Seela cracked. I saw it on the private stream. Camera mounted on the underside of the fireplace mantel. She didn't know it was there. She stood in the kitchen with a bag of frozen peas, holding them to the side of her face, though she hadn't been hit. She looked like someone in mourning. But the dead thing was her control. She wandered the house like it might apologize for being so empty. She opened my drawer, the one I used to keep locked. Found nothing. No secret. No letter. No gotcha. Just absence. And absence is the worst kind of proof. It doesn't explain itself. It just is. She called 12 times that night. No voicemails. Then came the message that told me exactly what I needed to know. You win. He's not answering anymore. I lost both of you. Are you happy now? Happy. The word made me laugh out loud. Not because I was, but because happiness was never the goal. Wholeness was. And I hadn't felt whole in years. You want to know what I did after reading that message? I painted a wall. Yeah, just stood in my new cabin and painted a single wall this deep, charcoal gray. One coat. Smooth strokes. Back and forth. Like I was erasing the noise she used to live in. That wall now has no memory of her. And that's more powerful than revenge. Later, I lit a fire. Sat on the floor with a bowl of rice and a boiled egg. Watched the flames crackle and pop. And I felt more alive in that silence than I ever had in her presence. I hadn't spoken to another human in 72 hours. And I wasn't lonely. Because finally, I wasn't watching someone live a lie. I was watching myself start again. The next morning, I got an email from our shared bank. Large withdrawal request. Flagged for unusual behavior. I logged in. She was trying to move everything. Fast. Out of desperation. Out of panic. But what she didn't know, I'd already separated my part. Weeks ago. Legally. Quietly. The money she thought would fund her next act? Frozen. Tied up in documents she hadn't read. Because while she was rehearsing betrayal, I was writing a finale. Not with fire. Not with violence. But with foresight. I didn't need revenge. I had planning. And when she'd realized that even her chaos had been outmaneuvered, that's when the true silence would begin. Not for me. For her. Because you can scream into the void all you want. But the void never screams back. I woke up before the sun. No alarms. Just that strange peace that comes when your body knows you're no longer in danger. I stepped out onto the porch of the cabin. Morning mist hovered just above the soil. Trees stood in quiet rows, still half asleep. The air had weight, but not heaviness. The kind of weight that makes you feel present, not crushed. I poured black coffee into a tin mug and sat on the step, barefoot, listening. Not to her, not to the past, just to the wind moving through the trees. It had been 12 days since I walked away. 10 since she called. 5 since she tried to drain the account and realized she couldn't. 3 since she stopped texting altogether. I hadn't blocked her. I just stopped answering. And sometimes silence is louder than rage. Later that day, I drove down into town. Not to hide. Not to check anything. Just to be around other people. People who didn't know me as Sela's husband, or the guy who lost everything. I went into a bookstore, small, independent, quiet. I picked up a used copy of a memoir with a title that said something like, "What you keep is who you are." I didn't know the author, but I bought it anyway. The cashier, a woman maybe in her 50s, with short silver hair and warm eyes, smiled at me and said, "You look like a man who just let go of something heavy." I paused, then replied, "I guess I did." And she said nothing else. Just nodded. That was all I needed. In the following weeks, I rebuilt routines. But not like before. No need to check who's calling. No need to wonder where she is, or what version of her would walk through the door. I cooked small meals, chopped wood, read under low lamps. I met people slowly, one at a time. A retired schoolteacher who loved old blues records. A mechanic who fixed things better than he spoke. A young woman named Karis who ran the local nursery and gave me a houseplant I swore I'd kill in 2 days. It's still alive. Turns out, when you remove chaos from the soil, things grow. One afternoon, as spring turned the hills green again, I got one last message from Sela. No begging. No venom. Just 2 words. I understand. I didn't reply. Not because I was cruel, but because nothing more needed to be said. Let her understand. Let her sit with the echo of her own voice. The one that told me I was predictable, unshakable, too calm to be taken seriously. Turns out, calm was my greatest weapon. I didn't destroy her. I just refused to carry her weight any longer. And that was enough. Today, I live simply. Not small, simply. I've built a new bookshelf with my own hands. I drink my coffee hot, not reheated after someone else's rant. And every night, I light a lantern outside the cabin, even if no one's coming. Not because I'm waiting, but because light belongs where peace lives. And I finally do.